The morning light had the colour of diluted milk, seeping without warmth into the empty breadth of St. Giles. I stood a while outside the convent chapel, listening for a sound that never came. The recital had been marked in my diary for weeks, a Bach fugue, played on a weathered organ whose notes carried, I remembered, a faint asthmatic wheeze. But the doors were locked, and the air that drifted from the courtyard was too still to have held any music. A man emerged from a side door, carrying a small brass watering can. His hair was the colour of dust that has sat undisturbed for years, and his face had the smooth pallor of someone who had not hurried in a long time. He nodded without warmth, as if politeness were a faint muscle memory, rather than an impulse. I asked after the recital. Postponed, he said, indefinitely. Then, after a pause, with the tone of someone reciting an address from memory, Sister Miriam has gone away suddenly. It was the gone away that caught in my ear, neither dead nor departed in disgrace, yet waited enough to suggest the sort of absence that would not be filled in a week. I asked no further questions. Some doors, especially in Oxford, prefer to remain only half open. I walked slowly along the length of the convent wall. The stone was that particular shade of lichen-patched yellow that never seems fully awake, even under summer light. A few blackened leaves had gathered in the gutter along the base, pressed flat by rain. Halfway along, over a recessed gate, the inscription was worn to the point of conjecture: Domus Caritatis, the House of Charity. Above it, a small angel was carved into the lintel, the left wing still sharp-edged, the right sheared away in a smooth break, as if the stone itself had been persuaded to forget it had ever been whole. A bell tolled somewhere deeper in the convent grounds. The sound was soft, almost apologetic. It carried no summons, more a reminder that time here passed in its own measured increments, untouched by the little urgencies of the city beyond. As I walked, I found myself thinking of the crossword from the Times that morning. One clue had lingered. Without flight, still heavenly. 5. I had left it blank at breakfast, irritated at my own inability to see past the obvious. Now, under the gaze of the one-winged angel, the answer came with the inevitability of something I had known all along. Still heavenly, yet without flight. Angel? No. Saint. When I reached the far corner of the wall, I glanced back. The mist had thickened slightly, as if to seal off the place behind me. A single window in the upper story was unshuttered, and I thought I saw the faintest movement, a figure drawing back from the glass. It might have been nothing more than the adjustment of a curtain, but the impression lingered, insistent as a word on the tip of the tongue. Crossing into the main street, the traffic felt almost crude after the chapel's hush. The smell of diesel and damp. Newsprint replaced the faint scent of candle wax that had clung to the convent air, yet the absence of music, of Sister Miriam, of something unnamed, followed me with a weight that was neither grief nor curiosity, but a quieter blend of the two. I stopped once more before heading towards Broad Street, and in the muffled stretch of that grey morning, I could almost hear the opening bars of the fugue, not played, but remembered, the kind of music that inhabits silence rather than dispels it. Lewis arrived with the habitual look of a man not entirely certain why he had been summoned. The wind had picked up, bringing with it the smell of wet leaves and something faintly metallic from the nearby roadworks. He glanced up at the convent frontage, hands deep in his coat pockets, as though the building itself might confess its secrets if stared at sternly enough. The prioress met us in a small parlour that seemed designed to make visitors whisper. The air had a weight to it, not stale, but aged, as though reluctant to admit anything new. She was a tall, spare woman with eyes that moved more than her head. I told her we were here in an unofficial capacity, that we merely sought to understand. "Sister Miriam has left us," she said. There was no tremor, no attempt to soften the phrase. Simply left. No word, I asked. None. She paused, folding her hands in her lap, as if to keep them from betraying the smallest motion. Her Bible, her rosary. They remain. We have no wish to involve the police. Quiet dignity, Inspector. That is the manner of our order. Lewis shifted in his chair, perhaps unsure if he was expected to challenge the logic of dignity over duty. I let the words rest. There are silences one can only approach obliquely. The prioress led us through a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of chalk and beeswax. At the end, she opened a door onto a small cell, the kind of room that exists without excess or apology. A narrow bed, a wooden desk, a single shelf holding 3 worn volumes. The Bible lay on the desk, its ribbon marker halfway through the Gospel of John. Beside it, a wooden rosary curled in a loose loop, beads darkened from years of handling. There was, in the air, a thread of lavender, not strong enough to be deliberate, yet persistent enough to feel recent. Lewis noticed it too, his nose lifting slightly, though he said nothing. I stepped to the desk. A folded copy of the Times lay beneath a thin sheet of blotting paper. The crossword was 3/4 complete, written in a fine, slanted hand. The pen still lay alongside, capped but not fully clicked into place. My eyes found the final entry attempted. 17 down, Faith's departure, 5. The boxes were empty. I murmured the clue to myself, tasting the possible answers. Loss, exile. But neither quite fitted the grain of the wording. Departure of Faith could be doubt, but that was 5 letters only if you stripped it to its bone. Doubt itself. Still, it sat uneasily, like an ill-matched chord. Lewis asked if Sister Miriam had taken any belongings. The prioress's reply was measured. A change of clothes, perhaps, though she could not say for certain. Nothing else. No farewell note, no explanation. I ran a hand lightly over the desk's surface. A faint indentation in the blotting paper suggested she had begun a letter, though the page itself was absent. The impression was shallow, the letters curved. Not block capitals, but the looping script of someone writing without haste. I could not make out the words, only the rhythm of them. Lewis opened the narrow wardrobe. A black habit hung there, neatly pressed alongside a plain grey cardigan. The small drawer beneath contained folded linen and a single pair of shoes. There was no sign of disorder, no hurried exit. Standing in the doorway, I took in the whole of it. The lavender scent, the half-finished crossword, the Bible left open as though its owner meant to return. It was the sort of absence that imitated presence, a room that resisted becoming vacant. The prioress's voice, when it came, was almost an afterthought. Sister Miriam was with us for 15 years. She took her vows at 27. No family in England, no visitors these last 4 years. We left the cell as we had found it. In the corridor, the sound of a bell drifted faintly from the chapel. Lewis glanced at me, his brow furrowed. You think she's missing, don't you? Missing, I said, is a word that requires consent from both sides. Until then, perhaps we should call it something else. Outside, the wind had eased, but the clouds hung low, the light thinning by the minute. I thought again of the crossword, the unanswered clue waiting like an unopened letter. The convent library was not large, but it had that density of quiet that makes time reluctant to pass. The light came thinly through high windows, settling on dust motes that seemed in no hurry to fall. A single radiator ticked softly in the corner. I let my hand drift along the spines, feeling the frayed cloth and faded gilt, until one volume, a 1923 edition of Herbert's The Temple, offered more resistance than it should. Inside, folded between the yellowed end papers, was a letter. Not sealed in the way one finds fresh correspondence, but closed with the tidy exactness of someone who has had to open it and did so unwillingly. The address on the front was in a narrow, angular hand. Sister Miriam, St. Anne's Convent, Oxford. No return, save for the postmark, which was Magdalen. I read it in the hush of the library, leaning slightly against the window ledge. It was oddly formal for a personal letter, as if the writer had rehearsed the tone more than the sentiment. It quoted a line from Herbert, one I knew well. Who sweeps a room as for thy laws makes that and the action fine. But here a single word was wrong. Laws rendered as cause. A slip small enough to pass unnoticed by most, yet jarring to anyone who had read the poem, aloud. I did not remark on it to the prioress, who had accompanied me into the library and now stood by the door with the look of one keeping an eye on both guest and books. She asked, without inflection, whether I had found what I was looking for. I told her I was only browsing. When I inquired again about visitors, she was firm. Sister Miriam had none, not in recent years. We left the library for the small vestibule that served as the guest entrance. On the desk there was a register bound in dark leather, its pages softened at the corners from decades of hands turning them. The entries were in chronological order, each with a name, a date, and the time of departure. I ran my finger down the list until 3 weeks earlier it stopped at a name written in the same narrow hand as the letter, Mr. Abel James. Departure time, 4:15 p.m. The prioress looked at the page without recognition. "I do not recall this person," she said. "Perhaps a tradesman." Tradesmen do not often leave their names in convent registers, I thought, but said nothing. Instead, I made some small remark about the neatness of the record-keeping. The prioress inclined her head, satisfied with the flattery, and closed the book. In my coat pocket, the letter remained folded, its weight negligible, but its presence insistent. I was already thinking of the Herbert misquote, the kind of alteration that could be accident or design. Herbert's original line spoke of obedience, of aligning the smallest act with a divine ordinance. To replace laws with cause was to shift the centre of gravity, away from submission to a rule, toward the justification of an action. Outside, the rain had begun in earnest. The paving stones gleamed under the thin light, and the air carried the clean, unadorned scent of wet stone. Lewis was waiting by the car, collar turned up against the wind. "Find anything?" he asked. "Only that some rooms have more than one key," I said. We drove away slowly, the convent receding behind us, its windows shuttered against the rain. I thought again of AJ, Magdalene, and the careful, deliberate hand that had written to a woman who, by the prioress's account, had been entirely without visitors. Some absences, I was learning, have more shape to them than presences. I went to evensong less for the liturgy than for the chance to watch faces in the slow, unself-conscious moments when people believe they are not being observed. The chapel, small and square-shouldered, was already half filled when I arrived. The stone still carried the day's coolness, and the air smelled faintly of polish and candle smoke. The choir assembled in the loft above the small organ, their habits lending them a kind of unplanned symmetry. The choir mistress, a woman with the stern posture of someone accustomed to correcting faults before they could become habits, glanced more than once toward the visiting organ scholar, a young woman in a dark dress, her hair gathered carelessly as though the day's work had run longer than expected. I recognized her, though it took a moment to place the name. Lydia Vale. Magdalene had been her college. That much I remembered. There was a time when her playing had been spoken of as something to look forward to, before the lists and timetables swallowed her name in my memory. The music began without preamble, a psalm set to a plainchant that climbed and dipped in the restrained way such music does, unwilling to leave the ground entirely. From my seat, I watched the choir mistress give her subtle cues, her eyes flicking toward Lydia in moments where a phrase risked faltering. Lydia's expression remained fixed, yet her hands on the keys betrayed the smallest tremor at certain entries, as though she were listening for something outside the score. After the service, I lingered in the cloister. The congregation thinned, footsteps echoing briefly before being lost to the stone. Lydia emerged last, carrying a satchel and wearing the expression of someone trying not to notice being noticed. I fell into step beside her. "You play here often?" I asked. "Only this week." She kept her gaze ahead, filling in for the regular organist. We walked a few paces in silence. I mentioned that she had once been at Magdalene, watching for any shift in her expression. She nodded, the movement brief. "That's where I met Miriam." "Sister Miriam," I said. "Yes." Her voice softened on the name, though she did not slow her pace. "We knew each other before she took orders. She left some things unfinished in the outside world." "Unfinished?" She seemed to consider her words carefully, as though they were glass and might crack if handled without care. Obligations, promises, a few of them not to the sort of people who forget. We had reached the small gate that led back into the street. I asked what she had done before joining the convent. Lydia gave me a sidelong glance, as if measuring what I might already know. She taught English literature, an Oxford girls' college, St. Mildred's, if I remember right. Good teacher, but not one for keeping to the syllabus. She liked her students to see the bones under the skin of a text. Some parents didn't appreciate it. She smiled faintly, as though the memory had a private contour I would not see. Then she excused herself with the sort of polite abruptness that is impossible to pursue without making it obvious. I stood for a moment after she left, the faint vibration of the organ's last chord still in my ears. English literature, a profession built on choosing words precisely, yet Sister Miriam had left behind a crossword unfinished, a clue unanswered, and somewhere a letter quoting Herbert with a single word altered. The choir loft was empty now, the stalls bare. I imagined the view from up there, the congregation spread below, unaware of the player's vantage point, the way faces look different when you see them from above. Lydia's glances toward the choir mistress returned to me, not quite wary, but alert, as though she too was reading a text whose ending had yet to be written. The evening was settling into a deeper blue by the time I stepped into the street. The bells of another church, distant but clear, rang a slow measure into the air, the notes lingering, like Lewis had the look of a man who had stumbled upon something without quite meaning to. We met in a corner of the Bodleian, the kind of alcove where the air feels older than its readers. He set a folder on the table, sliding out a sepia-toned group photograph mounted on stiff card. The caption beneath named it as the English Faculty Summer Gathering, 20 or so years ago. "She's there," he said, tapping the image. It took me a moment to pick her out. Younger, the face unframed by a habit, the eyes less guarded. She stood near the centre, the tilt of her head suggesting she had been caught mid-thought rather than posed. Beside her, a man whose smile was just a fraction too rehearsed. I recognised him from a case half forgotten. A fellow of his college later undone by a scandal in the accounts, not prosecuted, but gently retired, his name folded away under layers of genteel silence. "And here," Lewis said, pointing to the back row, half hidden by the tilt of another man's hat. The face was in shadow, the outline imperfect, but there was enough in the jaw and the set of the mouth to recall the register's Mr. Abel James. Not proof, but the kind of coincidence that leaves its mark on the mind. I asked where the photograph had come from. "Faculty archives," he said. No one had looked at it in years. We studied it in silence. The composition was neat, almost too neat. The sort of arrangement meant to suggest unity, yet Miriam's body was turned very slightly away from the disgraced man at her side, a fraction of space that felt deliberate once noticed. It was the sort of detail the casual viewer might dismiss, but which lingered for me like an unresolved chord. I thought of the crossword clue in her room, Faith's departure, 5, and felt its weight again. In her Bible and her rosary she had left behind the visible instruments of her belief, yet it was in that single unanswered clue that her absence seemed most complete. A departure can be voluntary or imposed. The letters for either might fit. Lewis leaned back, watching me. "You think this is about the old scandal?" "Scandals in Oxford seldom stay in the open air long enough to wither," I said. "They're pressed between pages, kept flat until someone opens the book again. And you think she opened it?" I didn't answer. The photograph was already telling me more than I could voice. The way her gaze, though turned toward the camera, seemed to rest on something just beyond its frame. We left the Bodleian into a dusk that felt older than the day it followed. The rain had held off, but the pavements shone as though it had recently passed this way. I walked without speaking, the photograph's arrangement still playing in. My mind. Miriam, the disgraced fellow, the shadowed half-face of Abel James, an alignment like notes struck together, the harmony more unsettling than any discord. When I reached my flat later, I laid the copy Lewis had made on the table beside the day's newspaper. The crossword was already half done. I looked again at 17 down. Faith's departure, 5. A simple clue, and yet not. Doubt, lapse, loss. Each fit, yet none settled. The answer, I felt, was in that photograph, somewhere between the visible and the obscured. The room was very still. Outside, a bus passed with the muted sigh of worn brakes, and the light from the street lamps caught in the glass over the photograph, obscuring the faces with a pale reflection of my own, estions to which no one had yet committed an answer. The shop in Jericho was the sort of place you could walk past 100 times without noticing, its sign discreet, its window display arranged with the care of someone who enjoys being overlooked. Inside, the air was cool, tinged with the faint sharpness of cork and dusted oak. Bottles stood in careful ranks, labels facing forward like a library of countries I would never visit. The proprietor was a man of indeterminate age, with the manner of someone who believed conversation to be a privilege earned rather than assumed. I'd come under the pretense of ordering a case for a colleague's retirement, a useful fiction, though one which demanded a degree of knowledge I hoped I could bluff. It was only after we had discussed vintages with the ritualized vagueness such talk invites that I let the name slip. Abel James. He took a moment to answer, weighing the name as if it might be a varietal he had once stocked. Yes, he said finally. Chablis. The same domain, the same year, every time. Deliveries? I asked. Always to Banbury Road, number 82. Not recently, mind you. Perhaps a month ago, perhaps more. Banbury Road stirred something at the back of my mind. I asked who had signed for the orders. Usually the lady herself, he said. A Miss Vale. Pleasant woman, knew her wine. Lydia Vale. The name settled into place with the slow inevitability of a well-fitted clue. I asked if Abel James ever came in person. Occasionally. Polite, a little formal, knew exactly what he wanted. The merchant glanced toward the back of the shop before leaning in slightly, as though proximity itself were a kind of discretion. If you'll allow me, Inspector, I've always thought those two had history. He said the last word as one might handle a fragile glass, not to be dropped and certainly not to be examined too closely. I left with a bottle under my arm, not the Chablis in question, but something modest enough to justify the visit should it be recalled later. Outside, the wind had picked up along Walton Street, carrying the smell of rain waiting for its cue. Banbury Road lay only a short walk away, and I found myself counting the numbers without intending to, until 82 stood before me, a tall, narrow house of pale brick, its windows curtained, its front garden littered with wet sycamore leaves. No sign of occupancy, though the curtain's neatness suggested absence rather than abandonment. The connection was becoming less a suspicion and more a shape I could trace with my hands. Lydia, once a promising organ scholar at Magdalen, Abel James signing into the convent under his own name, Sister Miriam, who had known Lydia before taking her vows, and who had left unfinished matters in the outside world. A bottle of Chablis recurring like a refrain. And then the letter, the Herbert misquote, who sweeps a room as for thy cause makes that and the action fine. That single altered word, cause in place of laws. It was no accident. The change bent the meaning, reoriented the thought. In Herbert's original, the act is sanctified by obedience. In the altered version, it is sanctified by justification, a quiet permission to act outside the prescribed rule, if the cause feels sufficient. I stood there longer than was reasonable, the bottle of wine cooling in my hand. If the quotation was deliberate, it was not simply an error of memory. It was a signal, a reframing. Someone wanted Miriam to read it and take from it the permission, perhaps even the necessity, to break from her rule. A bus roared past, spraying the pavement, and I turned away from the house. By the time I reached St. Giles again, the rain had begun in earnest, tapping against my coat and pooling in the hollows between the stones. The bottle felt heavier than it had in the shop, as though the weight of its glass had absorbed more than wine. In the quiet of my flat, I set it beside the photograph from the Bodleian. The faces looked no clearer in the lamplight, but the pattern among them felt closer to resolving, like the crossword in Miriam's room, the answer not yet written in, but present in the space the letters would occupy. It was Lewis who brought the news, standing just inside my doorway with the hesitation of someone unsure whether to enter. A woman's body had been pulled from the Isis that morning, near the boathouses where the current slows before the weir. Not Sister Miriam, he added quickly, as though the relief might cancel the unease. Another former nun, from the same convent. Her name meant little to me, Sister Agnes, before she had left the order some years earlier, shedding the habit for anonymity somewhere beyond Oxford. She had been found by a rowing crew at dawn, her coat heavy with silt, her hands drawn into the shape of something she had been holding but let go. The pathologist could not yet say how long she had been in the water. Among her possessions, kept in a worn leather satchel, a folded page torn from a diary. The ink had run slightly, the letters softened by damp, yet two phrases stood clear. Meeting him at Magdalen Cloisters, and later separated by a narrow-ruled line. The truth about the bequest. Lewis laid the page on my table, smoothing the edges with care. It was not signed, but the hand was steady, deliberate. The sort of writing one does when the act is meant to fix the thought in place. Magdalen Cloisters. I thought of Lydia Vale's past there, of Abel James appearing in the convent register, of the photograph in the Bodleian, with its blurred shadow of a man whose presence seemed half-intended, and the bequest, a word that in Oxford could mean anything from a library endowment to a disputed line in a will, always softened in public by the language of generosity, whatever its private history. We walked down to the river later, though the police cordon had long since been removed. The air was raw with the smell of mud and reeds, the water moving with the deceptive calm that hides its depth. A cormorant broke the surface briefly before vanishing again. It was easy to imagine the scene at dawn, the shouts from the crew, the sudden break in their rhythm, the silent weight drawn to the bank. I asked Lewis to find what he could about Sister Agnes's life after leaving the convent. People who slip away often leave only the faintest traces, yet sometimes those traces cross the same ground twice. That night I sat at my desk with the folded page beside the Herbert letter. 2 women, both once of the same convent. One vanished, one dead. Both with a thread leading back to Magdalen, to a man, or perhaps more than one, who had known them before they took their vows. And somewhere in the weave, the mention of a bequest, whose truth, Agnes had believed, was worth writing down. The idea of a past sin was too simple, too easy. Oxford had a way of drawing its own veil over such things, not in order to absolve them, but to make them indistinct enough to live alongside. Yet I could not shake the sense that Miriam's absence and Agnes's death were part of the same design. 2 notes in a chord struck years ago, still resonating. The river outside my window was invisible in the dark, but I could hear its faint movement beneath the traffic, a constant undertow against the surface noise. It was the sound of something carrying on. Indif. The afternoon was already leaning into the bruised light of early evening, when Morse rapped lightly on the oak door of Lydia Vale's rooms above a florist's shop in North Parade. She opened it herself, the faint trace of music, Rachmaninoff, if he wasn't mistaken, drifting from a gramophone in the corner. "Inspector," she said, with the guarded warmth of someone aware her welcome was conditional. "I wondered when you'd come." They sat across from each other at a narrow table, a pot of Earl Grey cooling between them. Morse declined the tea, but allowed himself a square of shortbread from the plate. "You've known Sister Miriam for some time," Morse began, "since our college days. She was not always a nun, you know. We shared a fondness for Herbert, and the same. Sense of humour, well, hers was drier." Lydia's eyes moved to the window, where the late sun flared briefly in the glass. "But some things happened back then, and she chose to vanish from certain circles." Morse waited, the silence stretching until she filled it. A man, not Abel James, another, made a spectacular mess of his career. Financial mismanagement, you'd call it. Fraud, perhaps. There were whispers about who knew, who didn't. Miriam wasn't implicated, but the papers were sniffing around. She took vows, in part, to put a wall between herself and the world. And now? Lydia sighed. The whispers have begun again. Someone threatened to drag up the past. She asked me for help. I told her she should go away for a while, France perhaps, somewhere she could breathe. You told her, or you arranged it? A bit of both, Lydia admitted. I've contacts, she left quietly. That's all there is. Morse let the pause linger until it became uncomfortable. And Abel James? Her mouth twitched into the faintest of smiles. Old friend. Knows the value of privacy. He agreed to tell you what I've told you, if it came to that. It was almost on cue that the telephone rang in the hallway. Lydia excused herself. Morse remained seated, staring at the patterned wallpaper, until her voice carried faintly from the next room. She returned, receiver still in hand. Inspector, it's for you. Morse raised an eyebrow but rose. The voice on the line was warm, almost avuncular. Inspector Morse? Abel James here. I understand you've been making inquiries about our mutual acquaintance. I just wanted to assure you she's safe in Paris. She's with friends, enjoying some time away from the cloisters." "Paris, you say?" Morse kept his tone neutral. "Yes, indeed. I had a postcard this morning. She writes that the Seine is beautiful in winter, and as Herbert once said, the best mirror is an old friend." Morse felt the smallest shiver of recognition. "Quite so. Well, thank you, Mr. James." He replaced the receiver gently, declining to meet Lydia's gaze. Back in his car, heading down Banbury Road toward the city centre, the streetlights flickering into life, Morse's mind turned over the conversation like a crossword clue that refused to yield. In the letter found in the convent library, a J had quoted Herbert too, but incorrectly. A single word altered, the sense just off enough to be jarring. At the time, Morse had suspected carelessness, but Abel James's quotation tonight had been flawless. Why would a man misquote in writing, yet speak the line perfectly from memory? Unless, of course, he hadn't written the letter at all. The thought sat in Morse's mind like a pebble in a shoe, not enough to halt his stride, but impossible to ignore. As he pulled into his usual spot near his flat, the air cool and damp with the promise of rain, he realized Lydia Vale's story was almost too tidy, too complete. A Parisian exile, a postcard conveniently arrived, an old friend vouching on cue. If this was meant to send him looking across the channel, it had nearly worked. Nearly. But Morse, who had once been led astray in just such a manner during a case in his early years, knew the taste of a red herring when it lingered on the tongue. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would go back to the beginning, to the cell with the lavender scent, the half-finished crossword, and the clue that still nagged at him. Faith's departure. 5. Errant to whether it held the living or the dead, the letter looked different under the Bodleian's brighter lamps, as if truth had been waiting patiently in the margins. Morse leaned closer, his fingertips resting lightly on the page, the smell of old paper and dust in his nose. The ink itself was unremarkable. The hand was neat, almost clerical. But it was the words, Herbert's words, or almost, that had begun to nag. He read it through again, lips moving silently until the substitution showed itself like a flaw in a diamond. One word wrong, then another in a later line. 4 in all, each chosen not for sense but for position. The pattern emerged with the inevitability of a solved crossword. The first letters of those altered words, P, O, R, T, and there, in the final paragraph, one more curious change. Mead, where Herbert had written field. Morse sat back. Port Meadow. Lewis, opposite him, was bent over the Bodleian's visitor slips, squinting at a signature. "Recognize the name?" Morse asked. Lewis shook his head. "Should I?" "No," Morse said, slipping the letter back into its envelope. "But we may soon recognize the place." They left the Bodleian, the last light over Oxford watery and pale. From Walton Well Road, the meadow stretched flat and grey to the river, the grasses bent in the evening wind. Crows wheeled low over the grazing cattle. It was a place of silences, the kind Morse distrusted. By the edge of the river they found it, a faint trace of a campfire among flattened reeds, a torn scrap of brown paper half buried in the mud. Lewis picked it up with a handkerchief. It was part of a wine merchant's invoice, Chablis, of course. "She was here," Lewis said. "Or he was," Morse replied. His eyes swept the waterline. Something pale caught the last of the daylight. Not bone, but a frayed length of rosary cord, tangled in the reeds. Lavender clung faintly to it. Lewis glanced at him. "Think she's—" Morse cut him off. "No conclusions, Lewis, not yet." They walked back in silence, boots heavy with mud. At the car, Morse pulled the crossword from his coat pocket, the one taken from Miriam's cell. His pencil tapped the clue. Faith's departure. 5. For days it had mocked him. Now, with Port Meadow in his mind, the answer came with irritating ease. "Leave. Leave," he said aloud, testing the sound. A nun's departure, a journey, a dismissal, all of them in one tidy word. Lewis looked over his shoulder at the flat expanse beyond the road. "She left. But where to?" Morse didn't answer. The cipher had not been meant for them. It was a rendezvous, a signal from one fugitive to another. But someone else had found the meadow too, someone who had reason to keep certain histories buried, and if Miriam had walked into that, then the quiet dignity of the convent would soon be nothing but another Oxford epitaph. Back in the driver's seat, Morse glanced once more toward the darkening river. "We're not finished here, Lewis," he said quietly. "Not by a long chalk." The engine started, but the answer to who would not come so readily as the crossword clue. The evening light bled across Port Meadow in a thin wash of gold and grey, the Isis catching the last gleam before surrendering to dusk. Lewis trudged ahead along the muddy towpath, his coat collar turned up against the September wind. Morse followed more slowly, letting his eyes wander over the wide expanse of grass and water. The air was damp with riverweed, and the faint metallic tang of the railway beyond. The boat shed appeared almost by accident, a hunched, weathered structure set back among willows, its warped door half ajar. Lewis glanced at Morse, who gave the smallest of nods. The hinges complained as Lewis pushed the door wide. Inside, dust motes drifted in the dim light from a single broken pane. The air was heavy with the scent of old timber and stagnant water. And there, against the far wall, lay Sister Miriam. She wore no habit now, only a grey skirt and blouse, the collar darkened with blood. Her hands were folded loosely in her lap, as if she had been resting when death came. Beside her was a small leather bag. Its clasp sprung open. Morse knelt, his knees protesting. A tear in the lining revealed the folded, ragged remains of a legal document, the telltale embossed stamp of a solicitor's office visible even in the gloom. Lewis crouched beside him. "A will?" Morse nodded without looking up. Part of one, torn deliberately. She meant to change something, or someone meant to stop her. He brushed away a fragment of damp paper, the words, "Bequeath the entirety convent upon full disclosure," emerging faintly. Lewis frowned. Full disclosure of what? Of the truth, Lewis. The truth about Magdalene. About a certain scandal we've only glimpsed the edges of. Morse stood, joints creaking. His gaze drifted to the doorway. "And I think our Mr. Abel James can fill in the missing pieces." As if summoned, a shadow detached itself from the path outside. Abel James stood there, breath visible in the cooling air, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Two constables emerged from the trees behind him, having approached by the railway embankment. "Morse," James said, his voice hoarse. "It wasn't meant to happen like this." Lewis moved to cuff him, but Morse held up a hand. "Tell me." James stepped into the dim shed, his eyes fixed on Miriam's still form. She wanted it all to come out. The investments, the trustees, what happened to the college fund. Said she'd sign the will only if the scandal was made public. I told her it would ruin people who'd done nothing wrong. We argued. She stumbled, hit her head on the beam by the door. He swallowed. "I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean for her to die," Morse finished, his voice low. "But you meant to take the truth with her." James looked away. "She was more than a friend once, before the habit, before the shame." "And Lydia Vale?" A faint, bitter smile. "A guardian angel for her, and for me. She thought she could keep it buried." Lewis's voice was blunt in the still air. "Then why the letter? The misquote?" Morse answered for him. "A breadcrumb trail. Miriam wanted someone to find her if things went wrong. She counted on me to notice the Herbert line wasn't quite Herbert." Outside, the last strip of sun slipped beneath the low clouds, the meadow darkening to shadow. The constables led James away, their torch beams bobbing toward the road. Morse remained in the shed a moment longer, looking down at Miriam's face. In the falling light, the lines of age and care seemed smoothed, as though some private peace had settled at last. He thought of the will, of the condition it carried, truth as the price of charity, and of how easily that price was too high for some to pay. When he stepped back into the evening air, the wind had shifted, carrying the faint sound of bells from across the city. He drew his coat tighter, his mind already moving toward the next piece of the puzzle, and the inevitable, unsatisfactory answers it would yield. The convent parlour was cool, the thick stone walls swallowing the sounds from the street. Morse sat opposite the prioress, a slight woman whose white, wimple-framed eyes that seemed more tired than old, A pot of weak tea rested between them, untouched. Lewis lingered by the door, notebook in hand, though Morse suspected neither of them would write down much of what was about to be said. "I understand you have news," she began, voice low, almost confessional. "We found Sister Miriam," Morse replied, "on the edge of Port Meadow. She's dead." The prioress did not flinch, though her fingers curled against the fabric of her habit. Then, "It has come to its end." "That depends on what you mean by it," Morse said, letting the word hang. "We have Abel James in custody. He claims it was an accident." She closed her eyes, exhaling through her nose. An accident. The repetition was not disbelief nor acceptance, but something in between, the sort of compromise Morse had come to recognize in Oxford's older institutions. "You knew she was in danger," he said quietly. The prioress's hands folded neatly in her lap, as though in prayer. "I feared she was in danger," she corrected. "But what could I do? She had a way of pursuing matters. Things best left undisturbed." Lewis shifted his weight, but stayed silent. "You mean the scandal," Morse said. A pause, then. "I mean the ruin that truth brings, Inspector. In the world you inhabit, truth is supposed to purify. In ours—" She glanced at the crucifix on the wall. "It can destroy faith." "She wanted the truth public," Morse pressed. "Her will proves it. The money for the convent, contingent on telling the whole story." The prioress's gaze did not waver. "And if we had accepted such terms, what would it have served? The benefaction would be poisoned. The sisters here would be hounded by the press, their vows mocked, their lives diminished. Is that justice?" Morse felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the same sensation he had in courtrooms when a clever barrister wrapped vice in the language of virtue. "So, you told her to leave." "I urged her to go, quietly, away from Oxford, away from him." Morse let the pronoun settle into the room. "And the call from Paris?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I arranged it, through Miss Vale." Lewis finally spoke. "You staged it?" "To make it look like she was alive and well." "It was better that way," she said simply. "Better for the sisters, better for the college, better for her memory. Or so I thought." Morse rose, walking to the window. Outside, the cloister garden lay in winter stillness. A blackbird hopped between the frozen stems, indifferent to the conversation. "The trouble with your better," he said, "is that it leaves someone lying dead in a boat shed while everyone nods at the fiction." She did not answer. The silence between them felt like stone, immovable and cold. When they left, Lewis asked, "You believe her?" "In the essentials," Morse said, fastening his coat. "She feared scandal more than she feared murder. In this town, that's not unusual." He looked back at the convent's closed door. "But it means Miriam never had a chance." They walked into the grey afternoon. Somewhere, faintly, the sound of the choir practicing drifted over the walls, notes carrying in the cold air, a hymn without conviction, each word carefully enunciated, and none of it telling the whole truth. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, a thin, persistent drizzle that seemed less a weather event than a quiet decision by the city to rinse itself of the last week. The windows of Morse's Jericho flat were filmed with condensation. Somewhere in the kitchen a slow tap drip kept time with the patter on the glass. On the table beside him lay a half-empty bottle of Chablis, its pale gold surface glinting in the lamplight. The label, faded from long storage, bore the same vintage